So yeah, thank you very much. It's kind of a weird situation. I'm trying to be here because then people online can see me better, but it kind of feels like I'm in the bear pit. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about Diamond Open Access and how we might think about that in relation to the future of the university. I'm kind of the Copim representative here. So we have many people here frantically tapping into Zoom, trying to get Caroline back, who are helping us, but actually the project as a whole is much larger. And we are doing a huge range of different things. Some of those things are represented on this poster. Those of you who are here in person, that poster is printed outside, just as you came in, so feel free to have a look at it. And those who are online, we can put a link to the poster in the chat. I don't unfortunately have time to talk about all the stuff we're doing, but you can see on that post on the right-hand side that one of the things that we really focus on is ways to support Diamond Open Access, because we think Diamond Open Access provides a route to a more sustainable and also equitable way of doing open access. Diamond Open Access, Caroline was going to introduce this in her talk, so maybe I'll have to do that briefly in my talk. So for those of you that aren't in this world of publishing, Diamond Open Access involves raising funds from libraries, but not to fund publications, but to fund initiatives, publishers, infrastructure providers. These subscriptions then potentially renew on an annual basis. So very different to the kind of model that if you're an academic, you're more familiar with, which perhaps where you might have an agreement with the publisher that allows you to publish open access, or the transformative agreement, or you might, or your research project might, or your department might, if you're lucky, pay an article processing charge or even a book processing charge. I'll get onto those in a minute. So Diamond Open Access is a different model, and often academics assume that open access is only the kind of pay model or perhaps the kind of repository model. So we're talking a different model. We have two funding models in our project that raise funds for that use a Diamond Open Access funding model. We have Opening the Future, represented in this room by Kira and Tom, to my left here. And then we have Open Book Collective, represented in this room by myself, by Kevin, and then a range of other colleagues who aren't here today. Opening the Future involves a collaboration with two university presses. We have Francis Pinter, who's involved with CEU Press and Liverpool University Press. Open Book Collective works with a range of different, largely non-profit, small to medium-sized presses, including academic-led presses and university presses. And actually, we are very much hoping that LSE Press will be our next university press to join. We're just finishing off doing the contract. That's a little perhaps breaking bit of news just for webinar attendees and event attendees. And yes, that's what I want to say about that. So how are we doing so far? So Opening the Future, 84 supporting libraries, 163 Opening the Future memberships, which have raised over 150,000 so far to support open access publishing. That means about 70 open access books, 25 of which have already been published, and that number will keep growing. Open Book Collective has 79 supporting libraries, and we're going quite as long as Opening the Future, which has raised over £750,000 so far, around 90% of which goes directly to our publisher and infrastructure provider members. So, you know, that's quite a, well, from my perspective anyway, that's quite a good news story. That's something to be kind of optimistic about, I suppose. But obviously, we organize this event here in the UK. We have an international range of online attendees in particular, in the context of some really challenging times for higher education. And we were talking within the project about this kind of contradiction, that we were feeling quite optimistic about things. And I should say, for any libraries in the room or online, I'm optimistic, but we really genuinely need your support. And we're not there yet. We are not sustainable yet by any means. We organized this event in the context of some really troubling times in UK higher education. The Queen Mary branch of our union, UCU, compiled a list of universities that are either have currently active redundancies or are restructuring or are asking staff to take voluntary redundancy. That list is over 70 different universities at the moment. One of those universities on that list is Goldsmiths. probably the most prominent example in that list. Doesn't mean it's more important than others, obviously, but it is kind of important to me because I was there. I was at Goldsmiths for over 10 years before I moved to Lancaster University. It's also important to me because, in a way, the work that we are doing, for me personally anyway, kicked off at Goldsmiths. So here are some photos from a workshop we ran in 2016 called Open Future, which is a kind of presaging the current name of our project. And those of you in the room that are in this world may recognize some of the people there. We have, for example, Sarah Kember, started Goldsmiths Press. We have Janneke Adema, who led the first project. We have Andrew Lockett from University of Westminster Press, handed over to Philippa, who's here in this room, who's now come to LSE Press. We have slightly in the room anyway, hidden behind Caroline Edwards' face on the Zoom is Mercedes Bunce from Mise en Presse, who is a member of the Open Book Collective. So those early conversations were founded then. This is at the Centre for the Study of Invention and Social Process at Goldsmiths. After this workshop, we then had a launch event just down the road to launch Mattering Press's first book. Some of those books you can find outside. Mattering Press is a press that I and some colleagues co-founded, a Diamond Open Access Press. So that was a real moment of optimism. And it feels very strange now looking at the situation at the moment where, yeah, it's a very challenging time for the university. This is where I have to turn to some notes. So yeah, so that kind of makes me wonder with my former colleague, Les Back, so I was in the Department of Sociology, Les was in the Department of Sociology, Monica was in the Department of Sociology. What Stuart Hall, so those of you who are sociologists or cultural theorists may know Stuart Hall. What Stuart Hall would make of the fact that his name is on a Goldsmiths building at the same time that the university is reducing to a kind of skeleton staff, perhaps the department that is most influenced by his work. So he might have said this: the university is a critical institution or it is nothing. Now, this is a quote that actually no one can quite be sure that he said. He may have said it. It's the kind of thing that Stuart Hall would say, but it's not actually something we can accurately cite. But let's just hypothesize that he did say it. What might he say, well, about the current situation? I'm sure he'd talk about the dangers of managerialism, of marketization, casualization, and perhaps some of the callousness that we've seen here in a UK context. I also hope you would say that we should also be critically scrutinizing the increasing dependence of universities on large commercial publishers. These publishers have been really successful at draining finance from the university system. Take Elsevier, the most kind of obvious and prominent example, actually kind of part of the Relics group, which owns a whole range of other suite of software and systems that if you're an academic, you're probably familiar with in various different ways. They, in their last financial reports, reported a £3 billion in profit from a revenue of £9.2 billion at a 32% margin. So we're talking here about a lot of money. And and then the kind of way in which, as well, through some of these platforms, there's this kind of marketization of academics' own behavior, something that my colleague Jeff Pooley called a moral indignity. And commercial presses have also been very good at monetizing open access. So book processing charges, this is a charge that you might get charged to make your book available on an open access basis. Large publishers tend to charge fees upwards of £11,000 for that. This recent report, the preprint, tried to estimate the total cost, the total amount that's been paid for APCs in the past 5 years from some of the largest publishers, and they estimate that's around $9 billion in total. These are article processing charges in the past 5 years. So, but I also hope that Stuart Hall would recognize that some of this is being actively pushed back on. Obviously, in Copim, we're trying to do that. But we have some librarians in this room, and I think if you're an academic, I think we need to recognize the work that librarians are doing in this respect. Developing new ways of assessing subscriptions, publishers, and so on. And I was at a conference last week where a very senior person in the commercial publisher actually, and here I'm going to agree with him, because he said, actually, we don't think that in the future that things like metrics alone will be convincing enough for universities when it comes to assessing publishers. Things like this, whether their publisher is community-led, whether they're sustainable, whether they have this commitment to open science might also become increasingly relevant. There is one thing, though, that he didn't mention, which was equity. And that was quite interesting because just yesterday, JISC, in collaboration with Coalition S and PLOS, launched this new tool to assess whether different publishing initiatives, how they might rank or how they might be assessed according to an axis of equity. We also have examples of universities here in the UK really rethinking about how they're doing the assessment of different initiatives. University of York, for example, developing a principles-led purchasing strategy rather than, say, a metrics-led purchasing strategy. University of Sheffield kindly shared data around how they've changed the way they do their budgets. Nothing in this budget for open access. 2022, 2023, 5% of their budget went on open access, and that's increasing over time. So this actually, this work of libraries that are happening in some library contexts led by some really passionate open access advocates. Yeah, I'll stop, I promise, Monica. I think really does represent the kind of application of the kind of critical scrutiny to this kind of hidden part of university business that Stuart Hall, I think, would have applauded. And I suppose for me, that is a kind of way that we might find a small bit of hope, even though it's happening in an increasingly precarious, increasingly damaged higher education context. Thank you very much.